Good afternoon. Welcome to the third session of This is Film, Film Heritage in Practice. My name is Giovanna Fossati. I'm the Chief Curator of Film Museum and a professor at the University of Amsterdam, where I focus on topics related to film heritage. This is Film is a collaboration between Film Museum, the University of Amsterdam, and the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. This series is realized with the master students of the This is Film class, who have an active role in introducing and interviewing our guests. This year's 29 students are divided in 6 groups, and each group is in charge of one session. Welcome to all of the This is Film students, those following from home, and those here. This is the first time that we are making the series also available online. We are happy that in this way, the lectures, discussions, and films will also be accessible to the followers abroad. The lectures and Q&A will be available on the website for everybody for free. The films screened during the sessions will be available on the streaming platform, the Film player, for a small fee. This year, we are focusing on the theme of recycle, reuse, and remix of archival films. Throughout the 6 sessions, we explore various aspects of film archival reuse and discuss ethical, legal, political, and aesthetic questions related to what is done with archival films, by whom, for whom, and to what end. As usual, each session of This is Film includes an introduction, a Q&A with expert guest speakers, and a screening. Due to last week's announcement that all US and NATO troops will leave Afghanistan before September 11, discussing Afghan film history today has gained a renewed relevance that we did not foresee when planning this year's program. The announcement of the military withdrawal has shifted once again the focus of international media on the country's uncertain fate, with a fragile government and still ongoing negotiations with the Taliban. Closer to today's topic, new questions arise about the country's cultural legacy and its survival and visibility. Afghan film heritage, as illustrated by the film by Ariel Nasr, The Forbidden Reel, has barely survived the country's turbulent past and was almost completely destroyed during the Taliban regime. The films preserved by Afghan Film, today the National Film Archive, are now having a new chance to be rediscovered by the Afghan and international audiences. This is thanks to the work of filmmakers and film scholars, Ariel Nasr, film historian Mariam Ghani, the National Film Board of Canada, and of course the staff at Afghan Film. This is quite an extraordinary achievement if we consider that preserving film heritage of countries outside the Western world, in particular Europe and North America, is not a recognized priority locally, but also at global scale. Film historians and archivist Ray Edmondson wrote an article in 2000 to discuss the situation of audiovisual archiving in Southeast Asia. There he stated, I quote, "Any survey of film and television archiving shows that the majority of the world's archived moving image heritage is stored in and was created in 2 specific parts of the globe, Europe and North America. So it follows, the world's moving image memory of the 20th century will logically be a predominantly Western one, both in its content and its perspective. Isn't that so? End of quote. Together with Edmondson, we know very well that the production of moving images is not unique to the Western world. Film has been a global phenomenon from its early days, and the reasons why archival vaults are mainly preserving Western films are economic, social, and political. To introduce today's theme, I would like to briefly address the topic in a broader framing, that of global audiovisual archiving. What is global audiovisual archiving today, and what could it be in the future? With global audiovisual archiving, I intend the global practice of collecting, preserving, restoring, digitizing, and presenting audiovisual heritage that by definition should overcome the traditional boundaries of national heritage and canonical film history. A global approach that surpasses the established channels of cinema distribution, festival selections, and mainstream streaming platforms. Finally, a global approach that rediscusses and overcomes the Western-dominated availability of audiovisual heritage. Such a global approach to film archiving must be possible today that digitization has created alternative and more accessible ways to make audiovisual heritage available on a global scale. With the digitization of audiovisual archives, moving images are becoming readily available remotely. This was not the case before the digital turn, as analog carriers, films, and tapes were only accessible in situ and required specific tools. Digitization provides an unprecedented opportunity to reassess our understanding of audiovisual history over the past 125 years and how it serves our collective memory. However, there is also a drawback. Audiovisual heritage that will not be digitized in the near future and preserved digitally risks being lost. To ensure that our digitized heritage will be representative of the global society as a whole, and to fully appreciate its wealth, the digitization and preservation process should be inclusive. This is obviously not the case today, and the clock is ticking. Film scholar, curator, and critic Abubakar Sanogo has written about the state of film archiving in Africa in occasion of the establishment of a cooperation between UNESCO, the Martin Scorsese's Film Foundation, and the FEPACI, the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers. That was in 2018. This cooperation aims at preserving and restoring 50 African films of great historical, artistic, and cultural significance. Sanogo points out that, I quote, "In the African context, as elsewhere, the archive is the visible evidence of our presence in the cinema since its very beginning. The archive is an indispensable part of Africa's history and memory. A lot, thus, hinges on the archival. But what is the reality of film archiving across the African continent? In a nutshell, archiving in Africa may be referred to as the site of monumental difficulties. Unfortunately," end of quote. Unfortunately, with the exception of a few important collaborative projects, such as the one discussed by Sanogo, the APEX project led by Juana Suarez in Latin America, And the collaboration between the National Film Board of Canada and Afghan Film in the framework of the making of the forbidden reel, digitization efforts are happening for the vast majority in Western countries. Audiovisual archives in Europe and North America are digitizing their collections, and they are focusing on their own national heritage. Audiovisual institutions in the lower income countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are only starting the digitization process, if they are digitizing at all. And because of this delay and of the lack of exchange of knowledge in the academic and archival community, their results are mostly neglected by researchers and curators. As we can clearly see from the online availability of audiovisual content, this is leading to a misrepresentation of global audiovisual heritage. That's the case in the digital and curatorial space, and it is only increasing and risks becoming irreversible. As digitization is a pivotal process that is already reshaping our audiovisual heritage, it is urgent that the archival and research communities work to ensure a more balanced societal contribution. This starts by creating a basis that allows promoting a sustainable long-term global exchange of knowledge and heritage. On May 30 of this year, iFilm Museum will host a roundtable discussion on the theme Global Audiovisual Archiving with guest speakers Maral Mosenin, responsible for digital preservation at Cinémathèque Suisse, and expert of audiovisual archiving with a focus on the Greater Middle East, Juana Suarez, professor at New York University and expert on Latin America audiovisual archives, Karen Chan, the director of the Asian Film Archive in Singapore, and Abubakar Sanogo, professor at Carleton University, Ottawa, Canada, and expert on African audio visual archives. The roundtable is meant as a kickoff for the organization of the 8th International Conference on Global Audiovisual Archiving that will be organized in 2022 in collaboration with colleagues from all over the globe. The roundtable will be made available online, and I hope many of you will see it and provide feedback that we will use for organizing the conference. And now, back to our focus today. I would like to introduce the Deze film students who will introduce and interview our guests today. These are Federico Candalano, Sara Gazzini Cardoso, Paul Schlumberger, Ksenia Bespalova, and Jons Klaasens. On behalf of the group, Jons will introduce our guest.
Thank you, Giovanna. We met with Ariel last Saturday, where we had a discussion to prepare for this session on Zoom. There we discussed his biography a little bit, the process of making the documentary, and what happened after the documentary. And from that, we compiled this small introduction that I'll be reading right now. Ariel Nasr was born in Halifax, Canada, to an American mother and an Afghan father, an identity which he calls Afghan. Brought up in a nonconformist family who ran a bookstore, Ariel was raised on his father's love of Bollywood cinema and became seriously interested in broader cinema in his 20s. He started filmmaking as an autodidact at 24, and his very first project began being an activist film centered on student poverty. After graduating from college, he won a ticket to Afghanistan, which he had never visited before, and during his stay there, he made a short film. And he also discovered the richness of Afghan cinema. This is when he decided to become a better filmmaker and to shoot more films about his dad's home country. Like many others of his generation, Ariel was deeply marked by the 9/11 attacks, because globally, Afghanistan would again become a negative point of interest. As a filmmaker, Ariel creates a positive dialogue about Afghanistan in his films, and he uses storytelling as an opportunity to make a difference. To him, filmmaking and Afghanistan as a place are deeply connected. His most famous documentaries center each on very different aspects of the country, which are usually excluded from Western narratives about Afghanistan. Good Morning Kandahar from 2008 looks at the dilemmas faced by contemporary Afghanis under Canadian intervention. The Boxing Girls of Kabul from 2012 centers on several young Afghan women training for the boxing competition at the Olympics, despite the disapproval of some of their family members. Among his other works are the interactive documentary Kabul Projects and the 2020 documentary La Mosquée, which focuses on what it's like to be a Muslim in Canada after the terror attack at the Quebec City Mosque. He also produced the film Buzkazi Boys, which received an Academy Award nomination in 2013. In the film we are discussing today, The Forbidden Reel from 2019, Ariel was motivated to frame the work of Afghan storytellers within the context of the near destruction and survival of the Afghan film archive. Ariel, thank you very much for joining us today and for your availability in the preparation of this event. We have all greatly enjoyed your documentary, and it inspired many questions that you'll be hearing soon. But first, would you like to add something to your bio? Maybe say something about a project you're working on right now? And thank you, and I would like to give the floor to you right now.
Thank you, Jans. What a nice introduction. I really appreciate that. I have, since October last year, I've been working as a producer for the National Film Board of Canada. So I'm the English producer for Quebec. So it means I have 10 or 11 projects that I'm producing at various stages. And that's a big change for me from being an independent filmmaker. But it's been a huge learning experience and wonderful to work with all kinds of different directors. So it's been a real treat for me. I don't have too much more to add, but I would love to answer any questions that you have.
So thank you, Ariel, and thank you again for being with us today, although I was really hoping this time would be in person here in Amsterdam. But again, I was lucky to see your film in projection during IDFA in 2019. And although we cannot screen The Forbidden Reel today in front of an audience, I'm very happy we have acquired it for the iCollection and included it to the iFilm player. I believe that films like yours play an incredibly important role in creating a more global awareness, not only on film history, but also and more specifically on film archiving. So I would like to start this interview with two questions related to the international visibility of the films discussed in The Forbidden Reel and to the collaboration between the National Film Board and the Afghan Archive. So my first question is, as you actually played a role in preserving and digitizing some of the titles held by the Afghan Archive, do you see these films being screened in Afghanistan and elsewhere? Are film programs being organized, and or are some of these films available for streaming?
It's a very good question. Thank you for that. Yeah, we did digitize a number of Afghan films in Canada. We had originally hoped to be able to digitize them and also restore them with in consultation with the directors. And so we had initially had some very hopeful signs that we would be able to do that, but ultimately some of this money fell through, and we ended up having to do the digitization project from the budget of our film, which was our pleasure to do, but we couldn't do as much. So it meant what we were able to do was do the digitization, but not the restoration. And so we sent those files back there to Afghanistan in a way that they're ready to be restored, and they're archival quality files. But we weren't able to go further than that, but at least we did that crucial step. We restored parts of the film, the parts of the films that we used in the documentary, but we digitized 100 times more than what we used, so that we could have this kind of reciprocal relationship to give back something. And so it was very interesting doing this process, because at the time, the president of Afghan Film was Ibrahim Arifi, who had been actually Engineer Latif's camera assistant for many years. He appears in some of the films. You can see him as an extra here and there. The only way this was going to happen was if he personally took these films and brought them, because there's such fear in Afghanistan of the loss of cultural artifacts and cultural heritage, and because so much has been lost. I mean, there's stories about how in the 60s you could buy statuary by the pound, from like Hellenistic statuary by the pound up in Balkh, where the troops of Alexander the Great once lived. And now that fear is so deeply ingrained that it's very difficult to form these kind of collaborations. So the only way finally we were able to do it was with the president of the archive coming to Canada. He spent a week at the National Film Board of Canada, meeting with all the technicians and touring and seeing how the archives there are held. So it was a kind of informational meeting as well. It was wonderful. I mean, for me, as somebody who worked with the National Film Board for years, mostly on films in Afghanistan, to now have these two things come together, it was wonderful. All over the National Film Board building, the monitors were showing his face and saying, welcome, Ibrahim Arifi, president of Afghan Film. It was wonderful for me to see these two institutions that I love coming together. So we did that digitization, and we took all those films physically and brought them back ourselves. That was a bit nerve-wracking, having all of that film heritage, on the plane with us, and unloading it at the Kabul airport and throwing it onto dollies and taking it. But every piece got back, and some of the material that we digitized, excuse me, was finished films, but other material that we digitized were rushes from unfinished films. And so, so that was what we were able to contribute to this effort of digitization. Now, I'm not sure if I answered your whole question. So if you want to do a follow-up, please.
No, I think you definitely addressed most of my question. Maybe the only thing I was also wondering about is that you have noticed more interest for that film history, that if you've seen more film programs, retrospective, being done on Afghan film history.
Yes, of course, yeah. And actually, there aren't any, and that is mostly because it is difficult to negotiate the rights to screen with Afghan film, and most, of course, institutions that would do that, they will respect the rights of the institution. So that has created some obstacles, and it's really just a problem of communication. It's difficult to access the institution. There are linguistic barriers, etc., so those kind of things do limit the screenings of Afghan films. What we wanted to do, actually, what we had proposed, that we were open to doing, was to have an agreement where the NFB would hold these archives and distribute them, and be a kind of a licensor of this material, an authorized licensor with an agreement. Eventually, that it didn't work out. There's a lot of back and forth. We had a nice big contract, and eventually, due to some administrative changes in Afghanistan, it fell through. But we at least were able. We do have a copy of those that we're holding for safekeeping for the archive, and they have the same thing in Afghanistan. But we're not licensed to distribute those films on their own, other than through our project and associated projects. We do have a small archive kind of interactive archive that we're going to put online soon. It's very limited, but there are some little pieces of archival material that didn't make it into the film, and some that did, that are placed on a timeline, so you can actually move back and forward through Afghan history and see. And then there's some captions to help support that, and we'll have that up by the summer. It's a small side project that we had planned initially to do with the film, but ultimately we are, myself, the producers of the film, and the National Film Board, we're all still looking for ways to partner with the National Archive in Afghanistan to be able to make these films accessible online. And I've had requests before the pandemic to help facilitate a retrospective using the files that we have in the UK, but with the pandemic, those efforts basically open up.
Thank you. And the online projects with the timelines sounds great. So I'm looking forward to that. Now, I'd like to give the word to Jons for the next question.
Thank you very much. Okay, there's an ongoing debate in the archival community between preservation of the original reels, the sacredness of celluloid, so to speak, and digitization. Those on the digitization side argue that through making multiple copies, you save film for the future, whereas the original is more subject to danger, as we can really see in this particular case. Speaking as someone who saw the documentary and became very much interested in a lot of the different films that were shown, little snippets of, particular Acta the Joker, that I would love to see at some point. Do you hope that, because you're encountering a lot of problems with it now, but that the existence of your documentary will help in the preservation of the Afghan archive?
Yes, this was part of the goal, and you talk about these two sides: the original copy and the digital copy. And I think it's also important to remember there's a less tangible asset, which is the copy in the minds of the viewers. In other words, how if you did a poll, how many people would have seen this film? How many people know the film? What are their feelings about it? Right? It's less tangible, harder to measure, but without that, you can't really preserve a film because there isn't the will, right? You have to have a living relationship. You have to have audience members who are seeing that and caring about it, right? And I think that outside of academia, that's a really important part of film preservation as well, because it speaks to the relevance, I suppose, of the film. And its influence on future work. So that was, in a way, this project is about that. It's about, and if I could pinpoint my kind of core audience, it would really be young Afghan people in the diaspora, especially, who are far from their culture, but who don't necessarily have any access to this material. But also Afghan filmmakers in the country who, by and large, do not watch these films, right? I mean, this is, in fact, and I think there's a kind of healthy rejection in some cases of the old kind of film establishment, especially by some of the younger female directors, which I think is very healthy and probably necessary. So this is like, to me, it was to tell the story of Afghanistan in a new way, but not in any kind of definitive way, but in a way that we could say, look what can be done with this material, right? You don't have to bow down to these films. You don't have to, develop some kind of respectful relationship with them. You can use them to tell the story of your country. You can use them in your own way, right? Now, I do have this kind of very avuncular kind of relationship with these filmmakers. So for me, it is a deep relationship of deep respect and admiration. But I think that what's more important than that is to feel that freedom to have a depth of cinema culture that you can reach into and actually use for any purpose. And I think that's, I mean, if there's one thing that I hope will happen, it's that younger Afghan filmmakers will feel that they can go there and that it's theirs and that they can use it either in a tangible way or as an influence to their work.
As someone who's not from Afghanistan, I was immediately interested in that film culture. So I really hope that that's something that you achieve with people that are actually from the country. So thank you very much for answering my question. And I will now give the floor to Paul, who will ask you something about the Afghan film archive and nationalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, Ariel. So as Jan said, my question treats the Afghan film archive and nationalism. So I wanted to ask, so multiple times throughout your film, it's been repeated that the Afghan film archive captured different Afghanistans that don't exist anymore today, that you don't see anymore. There also appears to have been a clear intention from the different filmmakers, and it's said explicitly by Engineer Latif, to create a uniquely Afghan cinema. So my question is, how can these different Afghanistans relate and perhaps interact with the country's new modern national identity discourse?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think it's a very, very different landscape, right? I mean, in the past, you had this real cooperation between the kind of reformist project of the state in its various incarnations and the filmmakers who were crafting. In a way, we talk about that these Afghanistans don't exist anymore, and I think that's true. And there's also Afghanistans in there that never existed, right? There are many dreams of Afghanistan that are just the country dreaming about itself, you could say. Or if you wanted to be less charitable, you could say it's the filmmakers dreaming about the country. But they had this project. I mean, there's a reason why in those films you see so many strong female characters. I mean, it's representative probably only of life in a very elite circle in Kabul and those times, not of life across the country, but the reformist project to reach out with this vision of how Afghan life could be to across the country, to even to those who were not illiterate, not able to take this information through book form, was an aspiration. And part of, I think, why these filmmakers saw their role as so important. And you really see that in their careers. I mean, they risked their lives to the point way beyond what we would consider rational as filmmakers, you know, in terms of safety. So I think it was really film itself was kind of an ideology, the most modern art form, right? And modernity was something that came later to Afghanistan than to its neighbors. And it came along with these ideas of women's rights and other reformist ideas about society. And I think that was a project of the filmmakers that was right in line with the state project. But when we talk about film after 2001, it's really different. I mean, these are really independent films. These are filmmakers who don't owe anything to the country's leadership. It's independent filmmaking, and again, it has there are all kinds of ways that it's happening and all kinds of visions for the country. A lot of the films are films that are from the diaspora, and in Afghanistan, I think it's important to say that the line between the diaspora and Afghans and Afghans in Afghanistan, at least the educated elite, Afghans living in the capital who have access to films and education, it's a blurry one, because often what will happen is that a filmmaker who is an Afghan filmmaker living in Afghanistan, after making some films, will soon become a diaspora in Afghan, or will leave to find more opportunity, or like in the case of Midnight Traveler, will leave because of a film that they made. This kind of stories are really common among the film circles, but there's still a kind of family relationship. In film, you see like back then, like a friend who helped us on this film, who was very close friends with Siddiq Barmak. They met during the fight against the Taliban when they were with the Northern Alliance. When he was a child, he lived right next to Engineer Latif's studio, and he used to watch over the wall Engineer Latif, and he knew Engineer Latif from when he was a child. I mean, so you have all these relationships that come back again, which is sort of typical of Afghanistan, I think in part because people have such wide social networks. They know hundreds and hundreds of people very well, so they find their way. But now you find similar kind of things happening. You had Mahmoud Baf, the Iranian filmmaker who came to Afghanistan and made Kandahar, and then he ended up financing Siddiq Barmak's movie Osama, right? And then you have Niloufar Pazira, who acted in Kandahar, who is actually Afghan Canadian, who then went back and made Act of Dishonor. So you have all these connections, and so it's not a huge, there's a small community actually of people making films, but none of them are doing what they were doing in the past. They're not in line with the state in any sense. But so the storytelling in that sense has changed. I think it's more, in a way, aimed at giving people a vision of their own issues, their own problems, their own emotions, so that they can see themselves reflected on the screen, right? And over that period between, the end of the communist regime and 2001, there wasn't a lot of film production. There wasn't a lot of availability of films. So, other, Pakistani films, Bollywood films, other types of films really took hold. And so people ended up feeling really starved for their own image on the screen. So I think that's more what is happening now. Is the films are often about they're about contemporary suffering. They're about what it's like to live in contemporary Afghanistan. Yeah. And then you have, of course, there's one great exception to that is Shahrbanu Sadat, whose film The Orphanage is like this amazing historical project. But and there's a lot of aspiration to do that kind of thing, to tell historical stories in a fictional form in Afghanistan. It's just hard to achieve. But she's this real standout who is able, with Katya Andomai, to achieve really great things. So there's a real renaissance, I think, of Afghan filmmaking now, actually.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I hope that we'll get to see more of Afghan cinema now as well. In the coming years. I'm going to give the floor to Ksenia. She's going to ask a question about the image of Afghanistan seen from abroad.
Hello, Ariel. It's a real pleasure to have you today as a guest. And I was really interested in the question that continues the line of thought that Paul started. There is a recurrent theme in your film. It is the theme of reconstruction of the image of Afghanistan. And Mariam Ghani speaks about it explicitly in your film, and she also elaborates on it in her essay on her film, What We Left Unfinished. And I quote, "The National Film Institute, Afghan Film, was responsible for projecting the image of a state to its citizens. However, I want to reverse this idea and to look into how your film reconstructs the image of Afghanistan for the audience abroad. And it does construct a historical narrative of the state. And as you mentioned previously, one of your intentions behind your film was the lack of the images that comes from Afghanistan itself, that most of the visual representation of Afghan is Western one. So my question is, what is, according to you, the role of cinema in construction of the image of a country abroad?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. Obviously, if you go back in the history of our institution here, the National Film Board, one of its initial mandates was really to reflect Canada to the world. So this is kind of, I think, part of this post-war project of trying to promote actually the country internationally. But I think that for me, yes, this film, it's about putting pieces back together. It's about putting fragments back into a place where they can form a picture. I think because I had this relationship with Afghan film since about 2009, when I met engineer Latif, who back then was the president, and I had made this rule for myself when I was making films in Afghanistan that I would follow all the rules that any Afghan filmmaker would be expected to follow, because you would see people going around with their cameras and people literally saying things to me like, "This is Afghanistan, you don't have to get permission." Really, really obscene things people were thinking. But then I decided at some point that I was going to, because I had got my citizenship as the son of an Afghan father. It's automatic. So I got my Afghan citizenship to go there. And so I felt like kind of somehow more indebted to follow the rules. And at first it was difficult, but it paid all these incredible dividends, because I got to meet engineer Latif, and I remember meeting him, and he was still living in communist Afghanistan. He had this old model of the Afghan film plans that were initially made by the Soviets to bring to Afghanistan the biggest film village, the biggest film production facility of all Central Asia, which at the time it was, I believe, in Uzbekistan, and they were. But it's a beautiful, beautiful image of this huge campus with all of these different film buildings, all separated according to their function, and it was a 3D model, like an architecture model. So he had that on the wall above him, and he was sitting there, and from looking at pictures of him in the Soviet time, he dressed exactly the same. He had this kind of khaki sports jacket and this cap. And he just at first was not very welcoming. He was like really pushing me. But eventually I came to see the Afghan Film Archive as a kind of visual memory, in a sense, of Kabul at least, and that memory wasn't functioning. Right, you didn't have a database, so you couldn't quickly remember, you couldn't quickly recall what you wanted, right? And pieces of it were faded, and pieces were broken, and so for me, the most apt metaphor was this kind of almost brain, a memory bank, and to try to make some sense of that, to bring some music to it, to make it tell a story. That in itself, I think, was part of this project, to kind of bring this archive to life in a way that told the story. So then it was a matter of what story does the archive tell, And every time, you hear it in the interview, but every time I speak to one of these filmmakers about it, they will say, the Afghan Film Archive is an illustrated history of the country. That's what it is. That was part of the project, So I think that was always part of their project, and yes, it's part of the project of my film. And but of course, you get in trouble with that, because how can you really tell the truth about such a complicated history that still has so much that has never been studied, never been documented, at least not in any way that can be accessible internationally. So how do you tell that story when there's no official narrative? There's no really functioning higher education in Afghanistan that can produce, and study and reflect on the past. So I think what I did was I really took the filmmaker's cue, and I said, look, these films are not objective, right? They're really made by these people. They're made with this perspective. And as much as you can talk about the institution itself, it's really the filmmakers themselves really determined a lot of what the content was and what the perspective was. So this is why you end up with this dual perspective, inside of communism, inside of Kabul, and on the front lines with Masood. And it was specifically Masood who had the loyalty of a lot of these people in the film circle, because they happened to be Panjshiri. And before the jihad, that had a totally different meaning. It just meant that they were from, actually Panjshir itself was not even a province until after 2001. So it wasn't an identity. other than he's from next to my village. And so, but after the jihad, all of these people who happened to work at Afghan Film and work in film, who were from the Panjshir, all of a sudden took on this identity without necessarily being in control of it, of being associated with the biggest resistance commander. So they took on an identity of being insurgents, possible informants, etc. And so that's why they were targeted as well. And many of them left and went back. So you have this story in which I have really privileged this one commander and this one group of mujahideen, and then life inside Kabul. So it's a very specific view still, right? But I just took my cue from the filmmakers themselves and tried to tell their story at the same time as telling their story of the country. I hope that answers your question. I think I might have gone a bit off track there, but
yeah, it answers it perfectly. Thank you very much. And for me personally, your film was a real rediscovery of Afghanistan as a state and its culture. And now I'm really inspired to look into more Afghan films. And I also today represent Sarah, who is unfortunately not able to be with us in this room. And Sarah wanted to ask you a question on the role of diaspora. And she asks, what is the role of diaspora in preserving the memory of Afghan cinema, and how the diaspora may help preserve the cinema that may not be well familiar to them, but at the same time, this film history is also a part of their culture.
Yeah, I think that the diaspora, of course, plays a big role. You can see perhaps a couple of the active members in this effort are myself and Mariam Ghani, who has done so much for the archive. Both of us diasporans, half Afghan people. But I think that, Afghan culture sees its diaspora really as Afghan. So, you have this situation where it's very patriarchal, but when your father is Afghan, you are automatically Afghan. So you, whether you want it or not, if you're in Afghanistan, you have that identity. You have that because you will have family there, because your family will definitely not have forgotten you. And I had this incredible experience of having a father, right? So I grew up as you know, in Halifax with my dad, who had come in '74 before most of the other Afghans in Canada. And gradually, more and more of our cousins, so becoming more and more surrounded by Afghan people as I got older. But the fact is that my father was very integrationist. Because of the war, he, like many, thought there's no going back. We're really here. And so despite my father's best efforts, despite having grown up in Halifax, despite having every opportunity, I still felt really driven to go back to Afghanistan and I always felt like an Afghan. So this is, I think, a testament. Even if my father didn't want me to go, he could not help but make me, tell me that I was Afghan, make me feel like I was Afghan. So that identity is very durable. And so it's this thread between Afghanistan and all its diaspora. And, it's hard to find anyone in the Afghan diaspora who really doesn't care, who really isn't deeply connected still. Most of our parents went through, so much trauma, and we were connected to that as well. So, I think that the Afghan diaspora is a certain group of people who have a certain thing in common, right? This kind of homeland that is completely destroyed, right? And so you have that in your identity and in your mind because you've grown up with at least one parent who experienced that trauma, right? So that, I think, creates this desire in a lot of diasporan Afghans to do something to kind of reintegrate or feel, at least in some way, to scratch that itch and to feel that they're doing something to help and to help really really reintegrate the story of Afghanistan, I think is really a common urge. And so I think that, that diaspora probably plays the most important role for all the reasons in doing this film preservation.
Thank you very much, Ariel. And now I give floor to Paul again, and he will represent Frederica and ask his question on politicization of cinema.
Hi again. Yes, so this is Federico's question. I'm just going to read it out loud because he cannot be here today. So on the politicization of film. So this is his question. From the documentary, it is clear that films are political statements. Even when they are not produced with the goal of sharing a political idea, they still depict a precise time in history. For example, the pre-communist films are not inherently political, but they show a time of Afghanistan which the Taliban would like to hide, to cancel from history. So film is never neutral, but always produces a statement, depending on who shot it, who produced it, who distributed it, and who watches it. It's necessary to preserve it because it keeps memory. So his question is, but how can we assure that those preserved films will be used to maintain peace rather than stress the differences and conflict?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think it's, this is maybe not the right fear about films. I think that we shouldn't be too concerned about that. I think we should be more concerned about who's telling the stories, why they're telling the stories, and whether the result is has some truth in it and some value in it. I think if film were in Afghanistan really exacerbating the conflict, what would that mean? That would mean a real penetration of cinema into the whole country and into the culture, which I think would be a good thing. If people were reacting to culture in such strong ways, I think that would be a sign in a way of progress. But I think that also when you talk about peace in Afghanistan or conflict in Afghanistan, it's like it's whose peace and whose because the peace deal right now with all its dysfunction, I think, is arguably setting the country backwards because and it's a deeply hypocritical project. I mean, it doesn't stem from a desire for peace. It stems from a desire for less American involvement in this war. I mean, that's like very obviously, and so there's this forced meeting of these two sides, which are inveterate enemies and whose conflict has only been heightened by the intervention. And I mean, it's like, to me, it makes me sick to read about, because it's the height of irrationality. And to say that there's any value in doing this, it makes me sick to my stomach. It's as though you can tell lies about this place because it just doesn't matter enough, we can tell you one thing yesterday and we'll tell you the exact opposite today, and it doesn't matter. Nobody will hold us to account because nobody cares enough about Afghanistan. We're just kind of glad that, okay, peace, yeah, do it, whatever, Does it make any sense? No, it makes no sense at all. It's as though you would make a sandwich with bricks, you can't. What does the Taliban have to lose out of this situation? Why would they do anything other than use this to their advantage? You cannot have a negotiation where one side has nothing to lose. It doesn't make any sense at all. So, it's a kind of betrayal, and it's a pattern. It's the same thing happened at the end of the Soviet-Afghan war when the Soviets withdrew. The U.S. withdrew their support as well, and the country spiraled into the worst civil war. I think we're more basic than that level, you know. We're more at a place where it's okay. You have this country where filmmakers have zero support, actually zero support. Like there's no fund for them. There's not a single fund in the entire world that is for Afghans. You know, there's funds, you know, for MENA or region or whatever, but there's no. So you have like compared to here in Canada, where we have access to provincial funds, federal funds, and also private funds, right? So it's very, that's where I would focus, is how can we support these filmmakers to get to a place where we can ask those questions, right? Where we can say like, what, you know, these films are having such a big influence on our culture, and we can talk about that. But I think it's still a place where cinema itself is not a major force in Afghanistan today. It's a major force in the imagination. I think it's a major. I think people view a lot of cinema on TV, but in terms of like domestic cinema creation, it's very, very, very low. It's miraculous that there's so much success from filmmakers like Sarha Karimi and Sharbanu Sarat and others. But but they're doing it really with not a lot of support, at least at first. And it's but so for me it's how can we bring more support to Afghan filmmakers, you know? And when there's no venue to sell the films either. I mean, I was talking to you guys about this, but broadcasters will ask for money to distribute films, like kind of a distribution budget line. It's a hangover from all those years of development money, right? Where media was created, and then media, there was a budget line inside the creation budget to also pay a TV broadcaster or to pay broadcasters to actually show the film so that it would have an impact, right? But so there's a very dysfunctional system when it comes to film. TV is thriving in a way. There's many, many TV stations. And so some of the filmmakers have, like Roya Sadat is one prime example, have done a lot of work in television and TV dramas and serials. But the aims are different from the aims of cinema. So there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for your answer. This was our last question. So we'll see you tomorrow, and thank you for answering.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul, Xenia, and Jons, and thank you, Ariel. I'm wrapping up this session, thanking you again for being with us today. I wish you could have been here in person next time, definitely. And then I also want to thank the 24 students following online, and as usual, the crew here at iFilm Museum. I hope to see you all back with us for the next This is Film session on restoration or reappropriation, where we will address this question with two colleagues from the Imperial War Museum, Matthew Lee and David Walsh, while discussing Peter Jackson's film, They Shall Not Grow Old. So thank you and see you next time.